He hadn't called ahead. 11 months of silence, and he thought he could just come home, knock on that door, and find everything the way he left it. He was wrong. The lawn was dead. The lights were off. And when Margaret Marsh finally opened that door, thin, pale, moving like a woman who had learned to make herself small, Daniel Marsh felt something drop out of the bottom of his chest that no amount of training had ever prepared him for. His mother had been left behind, and the man who did it had known exactly when to strike. If this story already has your heart pounding, hit subscribe and follow every part to the end. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. The exit ramp for Route 9 came up fast in the dark, and Daniel Marsh took it without signaling, because there was nobody else on the road at 12:40 in the morning, and because his hands were already doing what they always did when his mind was somewhere else working on muscle memory alone, while the rest of him tried to hold a thought together. 11 months. He hadn't been home in 11 months. Rex shifted in the back seat the way he did when he sensed something changing, not a threat, not exactly just a shift in the air. The German Shepherd had been with him through 6 weeks of field training, through 9 months of an undercover assignment that had taken Daniel so far off the grid that his own sergeant hadn't been able to reach him directly. Rex had slept on the floor of 3 different safe houses, had eaten whatever Daniel ate, had learned the way good working dogs learn to match his handler's mood without amplifying it. Right now, Rex was quiet, watching out the window, breathing slow. Daniel appreciated that more than he could have said out loud. He turned onto Calloway Street, and the neighborhood came back to him the way places from your childhood always do. Smaller than memory, a little more worn, the trees taller than they should be because time kept moving even when you weren't watching. Third house on the left. White siding. Blue shutters. The yard his mother had always kept clean because she said a yard tells people who you are before you ever open your mouth. He saw the yard before he saw the house. He pulled the cruiser to the curb and sat there with the engine idling. The grass was high, not just unmowed, overgrown the way things get when nobody has touched them in weeks, maybe longer. A bag of mail had been jammed into the box and then given up on envelopes sticking out at all angles, one of them fallen on the ground beneath it. The porch light was off. The front window on the left, the one that faced the driveway, the one his mother always kept the lamp lit behind, so the house looked warm from the street was dark. One of the panes in the upper section had been replaced with plastic sheeting and electrical tape. Daniel turned off the engine. "Come on," he said quietly. Rex was already at the door. He clipped the leash out of habit, not because Rex needed it, and walked up the path to the front door. The concrete had a crack running through it that hadn't been there before. He knocked twice, then again, and when he heard nothing, he tried the bell which didn't ring, and then he said loud enough to carry through the door, "Mom, it's Daniel. I'm home." Silence. Then footsteps. Slow ones. The kind that come from someone who has learned not to rush toward a sound at night. The chain went on before the door opened. He saw one eye through the gap, brown-rimmed with exhaustion, and then the chain came off fast, and the door swung wide, and Margaret Marsh stood there in a housecoat and bare feet, and said, "Daniel." Just his name, nothing else. He put his arms around her and felt immediately that she was thinner than she should have been. Not dramatically. Not the kind of thin that announces itself. The kind that creeps in over months when someone stops eating full meals and starts calling it not being hungry. She held on for a long moment without saying anything, and then she stepped back and looked at him the way mothers look at their sons when they've been worrying too long and are trying not to show how much. "You could have called," she said. "The assignment ended 3 days ago. I drove straight through." "You look tired." "I'm fine. Can I come in?" She smiled at that, at the absurdity of him asking, and stepped aside. Rex walked in at Daniel's heel, and Margaret looked down at the dog, and something in her face softened in a way it hadn't yet, since the door opened. "This is Rex," Daniel said. She reached down and let Rex smell her hand. He did, and then he pressed his head against her palm in the quiet, deliberate way he had not trained just his nature, and she scratched behind his ear, without thinking about it, the way you do when something feels instinctively safe. Daniel looked around the kitchen while she was doing that. He did it the way he'd been trained to do it. Inventory without announcement. Read the room before you say a word. The table had 2 chairs. One of them had a jacket draped over it that wasn't his mother's size, a man's jacket, brown canvas collar worn through. It had been there long enough that it looked permanent. The counter had dishes in the drying rack, 2 cups, a single plate. The refrigerator had a handwritten note stuck to it with a piece of tape, and even from across the room, Daniel could see it was a list of some kind. Reminders, times, names. The kind of list someone makes when they're managing alone. He opened the refrigerator. Half a stick of butter. A container of leftover soup that smelled like it had been there too long. 3 eggs, a partial loaf of bread, a jar of pickles. He closed the refrigerator. "Where's Gerald?" he said. The question landed in the room and sat there. Margaret was still facing Rex. She didn't turn around right away. "He's been away," she said. "Away where?" "Business." She finally straightened up and moved toward the counter, picking up the dish towel and folding it the way she always folded things when she needed something to do with her hands. "He had some things to take care of. He's been back and forth." "How long has he been gone?" She set the towel down, picked it up again. "A while." "Mom," he said it quietly. "How long?" She looked at him then, and he saw it, the thing behind the careful answer, the thing behind the composure. It wasn't grief exactly. It was closer to the expression people get when they've been holding something heavy for so long that they've forgotten what their arms feel like without it. 3 months, she said. Give or take. Daniel pulled out the chair, the one without the jacket, and sat down. Rex went and stood near Margaret. 3 months, Daniel repeated. And you didn't say anything in your letters. You were working. You had your assignment. I didn't want to. Mom. It wasn't that serious, Daniel. He travels for work. You know how it is. He looked at her for a long moment. Gerald doesn't travel for work. He's a property consultant. He makes calls. He meets people locally. Things change. Is he answering his phone? The pause that followed was a fraction too long. Sometimes, she said. Daniel put both hands flat on the table. He wasn't angry, not yet, not exactly. He was doing the thing he did in the field when something was off, but he didn't have enough to go on yet. He was building a picture one detail at a time, and every detail he was getting was pointing in the same direction. I'm going to make something to eat, he said, and then you're going to sit down and talk to me. Not the version you've been telling yourself, the real version. She started to object, and he was already at the refrigerator, and the look on his face when he opened it again the second time slower was the look of a man recalculating something. There's nothing here, he said. I was going to go to the store tomorrow. What did you eat today? Silence. Mom, what did you eat today? I had some soup earlier. He closed the refrigerator. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said what they were both now understanding. He picked his keys up off the table and said, I'll be back in 20 minutes. Don't lock the bolt. He drove to the 24-hour grocery 2 miles away, and he sat in the parking lot for 4 minutes before he went in. Not because he needed the time to collect himself, but because he needed to make sure what was happening to his face wasn't going to be the first thing his mother saw when he walked back through her door. He bought enough food for a week. When he got back, she was at the kitchen table with Rex beside her, and Rex had put his head on her knee the same way he did with Daniel, when he could sense that stillness that comes just before something breaks. Daniel put the groceries away without talking. He made eggs and toast and poured her a glass of milk and set it in front of her and pulled out the other chair and sat down. She ate. He waited. When the plate was half empty, she put her fork down and said without looking at him, I don't want you to make this into something bigger than it is. Tell me what it is. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at them for a moment. Then she said, He took some money from our joint account. before he left. Daniel kept his voice level. How much? Most of it. Most of what you had together, or most of what you had at all? She didn't answer. That was the answer. Mom. His voice was careful, the way a person's voice is careful when they're working very hard not to let it do something else. How much of your savings is gone? She finally looked up, and the expression on her face wasn't shame. He needed her to know it wasn't shame, but he hadn't said that yet because he was still trying to put together what he was hearing. It was something older than shame. It was the look of a woman who had believed something for a long time and has just been forced by the presence of someone who loves her to stop pretending. All of it, she said. He cleaned out the account the week after you went under. He said he was going to invest it. He had paperwork. It looked right. Did you sign anything? He said it was just authorization forms for the investment account. Did you read what you signed? Her jaw tightened. He was my husband, Daniel. He held himself very still. I know. I'm not blaming you. I need to understand what happened. He leaned forward. Were there any other documents? Anything about the house? Anything about a lien or a second mortgage or property authorization? The color that left her face told him everything before she spoke. There was something about the property, she said slowly. He said it was a routine refinance. Better rate. He said it would lower the payment. Daniel stood up from the table. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her for a moment. And in that moment, he was doing the kind of math that made his stomach drop: the timeline, the signatures, the absence of money, the timing of his assignment, the window Gerald had worked with. 11 months. He had been unreachable for 11 months. And Gerald had known it before Daniel did. He turned back around. When did Gerald find out about my assignment? The specific dates. Margaret blinked. I told him. When you called to say goodbye before you went under. He was right there. He heard the whole call. The silence in the kitchen was very complete. Rex lifted his head from Margaret's knee and looked at Daniel. Daniel sat back down slowly. He put his hands on the table again. He looked at his mother. Really looked at her. At the weight she'd been carrying in the lines around her eyes, at the careful way she held herself, at the bruise on her forearm that she'd been keeping angled away from him since he walked in. Mom. His voice was very quiet. The bruise on your arm. How did that happen? She turned her arm slightly inward. I fell. When? A few weeks ago. Before or after Gerald left? The pause was 3 seconds long. Before, she said. He didn't push it further. Not yet. He made a note of it the way he made notes of everything filed it held. It gave it the weight it deserved, and he reached across the table and put his hand over hers. I need you to listen to me, he said, and I need you to hear this the right way. What happened to you is not your fault. Gerald knew what he was doing. He planned it. He planned it around me, around my schedule, around the fact that I was going to be out of reach. Do you understand what I'm telling you? She looked at him for a long moment. He chose you, Daniel said, and his voice only cracked at the end of it, just at the very end, just for a second. He didn't fall into your life. He chose you specifically. And I need to find out how many other people he's done this to. Margaret's hand turned over under his and held on. Rex rested his chin back on her knee. Outside, the street was quiet and dark, and the lawn was still overgrown, and the mail was still stacked in the box, and everything about the house still looked wrong from the outside. But in the kitchen, something had shifted. Not fixed, not resolved, not yet. But the door was open, and the light was on, and Daniel Marsh was home, and Gerald Booth had just run out of time. He didn't sleep that night. He got his mother into bed just after 2 in the morning, sat with her until her breathing evened out, and then he went back to the kitchen, opened his laptop on the table, and started working. Rex lay on the floor beside him, not sleeping either, just present. The first thing Daniel did was pull up the county property records. It took him 11 minutes to find it. The lien. Filed 8 months ago, 3 weeks after he went under. Margaret Ellen Marsh listed as sole grantor. Gerald R. Booth listed as beneficiary. The amount attached to the lien was $62,000, which, based on what he knew of his mother's finances, was likely more than half the equity she'd spent 30 years building in that house. He stared at the screen for a long time. Then he pulled up the second document attached to the same filing. There was a signature on it, his mother's name in her handwriting. But something about the pressure of the letters was off, too deliberate, too even, like someone who was either copying a signature or had been coached very carefully on how to produce one that would pass a notary's review. Or like someone who had signed something without fully understanding what she was signing. He photographed both documents with his phone and closed the laptop. He sat in the dark kitchen with his coffee going cold, and he thought about Gerald Booth. Really thought about him the way you think about a suspect when you're starting to see the shape of what they are underneath what they showed you. Daniel had met Gerald 3 years ago. His mother had been widowed 6 years before that, and she'd done everything right. She'd grieved, she'd rebuilt. She'd found a book club and a garden and a Sunday routine that gave her something to look forward to. She hadn't been looking. That was the thing Daniel kept coming back to. She hadn't been looking. Gerald had found her at a church fundraiser. Quiet. Well-dressed. Attentive in the way men are attentive when they've learned that attention is a tool. He'd brought her coffee. He'd laughed at her jokes. He'd called the next day and the day after, and by the third week, he was fixing things around the house that she hadn't even mentioned were broken. Daniel had met him at a Sunday dinner 4 months in. He'd run the read he always ran, watched the eyes watch the hands, watched how he treated the waitstaff when he thought nobody senior was watching. He'd come away thinking solid guy. Maybe a little too polished, but solid. He'd told his mother to give him a chance. That sentence had been living in him since the moment she said all of it at this same table 2 hours ago, and it was not getting any quieter. He picked up his phone and called a number he hadn't used in months. It rang 4 times before a groggy voice answered. Marsh, do you know what time it is? I need a favor, Tommy. Tommy Reyes had been Daniel's partner for 2 years before the undercover assignment pulled Daniel out of rotation. Financial crimes background, good instincts, the kind of guy who remembered everything and asked for nothing. Daniel trusted him the way you trust people. You've worked bad scenes with, not because you chose to, but because the work chose for you. What kind of favor? Tommy said. The sleepiness was already fading from his voice. He'd worked with Daniel long enough to know that a middle-of-the-night call wasn't a small thing. I need you to run a name for me. Gerald Raymond Booth. Mid-50s property consultant background, last known address in Harlan County, but probably mobile by now. Your stepfather. X, allegedly. A pause. You home? Yeah. And you found something. I found a lot of things. I need to know if there's a pattern somewhere in the system. Prior complaints, civil suits, anything involving elderly women property financial exploitation. Tommy was quiet for a moment. Daniel could hear him moving, the sound of a light switching on. Give me until morning. I'll pull what I can through legitimate channels and call you by 8. Thank you. Daniel. Tommy's voice dropped. How's your mom? Daniel looked at the door to her room. She's hanging in. Okay. A beat. Get some sleep if you can. He didn't sleep. By 4 in the morning, he had built a timeline on a yellow legal pad, every date he could confirm, every dollar amount his mother had mentioned, every document he'd found so far. Gerald had moved fast, but not recklessly. That was what stood out. There was a patience to it, a sequence. He'd gotten the joint account first, then the property lien, and the way the dates lined up against Daniel's assignment schedule made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The joint account had been emptied in the first 2 weeks after Daniel went under. The lien had been filed in the 3rd week. Gerald had been waiting. He had not panicked, had not overreached, had not made the kind of mistakes that come from greed outrunning planning. He had been deliberate. which meant one of two things. Either he'd done this before and gotten away with it, or he'd done this before and gotten away with it more than once. At 6:45, his mother's bedroom door opened, and she came to the kitchen in her housecoat, and she stopped when she saw the legal pad and the stack of papers on the table. "You were up all night," she said. "I slept a little." She looked at him in a way that said she did not believe that, and she went to the counter and started the coffee without asking whether he wanted any, because she'd been making coffee for him since he was 17 years old, and some things don't need to be asked. "Daniel," she said with her back to him, "what are you going to do?" "I'm going to find him." "And then what?" "And then I'm going to make sure he can't do this to anyone else." She poured 2 cups and set one in front of him, and stood at the counter with her own, not sitting like she needed the option to move. "I don't want you to do something that costs you your badge." "It won't. You have to promise me that." He looked up at her. "I promise you, I'll do this right. Every step documented, every piece of evidence handled properly, nothing that a defense attorney can touch. Okay." She nodded slowly. She sat down. She wrapped both hands around her cup, and she said very quietly, "He told me you'd be gone a year. He said it like he already knew, before I even knew the full timeline." Daniel set his pen down. "When did he say that?" "The week before you left. I told him you'd called about the assignment, and he asked how long. I said I wasn't sure, maybe 6 months, maybe more. And he said, these things always run longer than they plan for. Probably a year." Just like that. Like he'd looked it up. The silence between them was very dense. "Did he ever ask specific questions about my assignment, where I was going, who I was working with?" "He asked once. I told him I didn't know the details," which was true. "But he knew I'd be unreachable." "Yes." Daniel picked up his pen again and wrote 3 words at the bottom of the page, underlined them twice, and circled the date beside them. He knew before. Tommy called at 7:58. "Okay," Tommy said, and his voice had a particular quality that Daniel recognized, the tone of someone who has found more than they expected and is measuring how to deliver it. "Gerald Raymond Booth, you ready?" "Go." 2 prior civil complaints. Both settled out of court, no admission of liability. First one, 7 years ago, woman in her late 60s, widowed, rural property. Her adult son filed a complaint with the state AG alleging financial exploitation. The complaint mentioned forged authorization documents on a property refinance. He paused. "Sound familiar?" "Very." Second complaint 4 years ago. Similar setup. Elderly woman, grown children out of state. That one also settled. The woman passed away 8 months after the settlement, so the family didn't pursue criminal charges. Another pause. "Here's where it gets bigger, Daniel. I ran him through the financial exploitation database, the Joint Task Force one, the federal one, and there's a flag on his name from 18 months ago. A flag, not an open case. Someone in the Denver field office pulled his name in connection with a broader network. A coordinated scheme targeting elderly women with absent adult children, widows specifically. They've been building it slowly." Daniel was very still. "How many victims?" he said. "The number attached to the flag is 11 confirmed. The task force thinks the real number is closer to 20. 11 women, 20 women. He thought about his mother at this table, eating soup that had been there too long, explaining away a bruise on her arm that happened before Gerald left. He thought about how many other kitchens looked exactly like this one. How many other daughters and sons were going to come home someday and open a refrigerator that had almost nothing in it and understand in that sick, dropping moment how long it had been going on. "Who's running the federal case?" he said. "Agent named Solis. Karen Solis, Denver field office. She's been on this for 8 months. I need to talk to her." "I figured you'd say that. I already sent her your contact. She said she'll call you this afternoon." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Tommy." "Yeah." Thank you. Don't thank me. Just handle this clean. You hearing me? I'm hearing you. He ended the call and sat with it for a moment, the full shape of what he now knew pressing down on him with a weight that was different from anger. Anger would have been easier. What he felt was something colder and more complicated because 11 months ago, he'd sat across from Gerald Booth at his mother's dinner table and eaten pot roast and talked about baseball, and the whole time Gerald had already been planning this, had already been timing. It had already looked at Margaret Marsh and seen a calculation instead of a person. His mother appeared in the doorway. She read his face the way she'd always been able to read it, even when he thought he was keeping it neutral. "How bad?" she said. "He's done this before," Daniel said. "Multiple times. There's a federal investigation." She absorbed that. He watched her process it, the slight shift in her expression, the breath she took, the way she straightened, almost imperceptibly. Not collapsing, adjusting, the way she'd always done things. "So I wasn't the first," she said. "No." She nodded slowly, and there was something in her face that surprised him. Not relief exactly, but the particular look of a person whose private shame has just been put into a larger context that changes its shape entirely. She hadn't been foolish. She hadn't been naive in any way that was unique to her. She had been targeted, precisely, by someone who had practiced. "But you'll make sure I'm the last," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," he said. "I will." Rex crossed the kitchen and sat beside Daniel's chair and pressed against his leg, and Daniel reached down without looking and rested his hand on the dog's back, and for just a moment the three of them were very still in that kitchen. The mother, the son, and the dog that had come home with him, while the weight of everything settled into something that felt for the first time since he'd turned onto Calloway Street the night before like solid ground. At 2:17 that afternoon his phone rang. The number was a Denver area code. "Officer Marsh," the voice said. "This is Special Agent Karen Solis. I understand you may have something that belongs to my case." She was direct, efficient. The kind of voice that didn't waste time on pleasantries, because pleasantries cost minutes that could cost cases. Daniel respected that immediately. "I have a victim," he said. "My mother. And I have documentation, a forged property lien, depleted joint accounts, a timeline that matches the pattern you've been building. I also have something you may not have." "What's that?" "Gerald Booth told my mother before I even knew the final timeline of my assignment that I'd be gone a year. He knew the window before I did, which means he either had a source inside the department or he was watching me directly and made an educated guess that turned out to be exactly right." Silence on the line. Not the silence of someone who didn't understand what they'd just heard. The silence of someone who did. "Officer Marsh," Solis said carefully, "how quickly can you get me copies of everything you have? I can have a complete file to you within the hour." "Do that." A pause. "And Officer Marsh, don't approach Booth directly. I know what he's done to your family. I understand the impulse, but if you touch this case with anything other than clean hands, you hand his attorney everything they need to walk him." "I know," Daniel said. "I've been doing this long enough to know." "Good." Another pause, and her voice shifted slightly, not warmer exactly, but more human. "Your mother, is she safe?" "She is now." "Okay." A beat. "We'll find him. He's not as good at disappearing as he thinks he is." He ended the call and looked down at the legal pad at the timeline he'd built in the dark hours before dawn at the 3 underlined words at the bottom of the page. He knew before. Gerald Booth had sat across from him at a dinner table and smiled and passed the bread and already had a plan in motion. Had looked at Margaret Marsh and seen a target. Had factored Daniel's absence in like a line item in a budget. And now Daniel had handed everything he'd built in one sleepless night to a federal agent with 8 months of groundwork already done. It wasn't enough yet. It wasn't over yet. But somewhere out there, Gerald Booth was still moving, still breathing, still running through the same calculations, probably already circling the next woman on whatever list he kept. And he had no idea the clock had just run out. The file Daniel sent to Karen Solis was 47 pages long. He built it in 3 hours, photographs of every document, a written timeline cross-referenced against the property records. His mother's account statements going back 18 months, and a 2-page summary of his conversation with Margaret the night before, written in the precise clipped language of a police report, because that was the language that held up. He sent it encrypted. He sent it with a cover note that said, "One thing, I will follow your lead. Tell me where I'm useful." Then he waited. Waiting was the hardest part of any case. He'd learned that early and never fully made peace with it. The work you could do felt like movement. The waiting felt like the thing that was hurting someone kept hurting them while you stood still. He used the time to fix things around the house. The window latch, a loose hinge on the back door, a fuse that had been half-tripped and was causing one of the outlets in the hallway to deliver intermittent power. He worked with his hands because his hands needed something to do, and his mother sat in the living room with Rex beside her and watched a television program she wasn't really watching, and occasionally she'd glance toward whatever room he was in and then look away, and neither of them needed to say what they were both thinking. Gerald Booth was somewhere, moving, planning, breathing the same air as people who didn't know what he was. On the second day, Solis called back. "Your timeline is clean," she said without preamble. "Everything you sent matches what we've been building. The lien documentation, the signature on the second page, we've seen that same notary stamp on 2 prior victims' documents. Same stamp, different counties, which means he has either a corrupt notary in his network or a very good forged stamp." "You said 11 confirmed victims," Daniel said. "I need to understand how he found them." "That's what took us 8 months to map," Solis said. "He doesn't work alone. There's at least one other person feeding him targets. Someone with access to a database, property tax records, probate filings, Social Security supplemental applications. Someone who can flag women who own property outright or carry significant equity, who have no co-owner listed and whose family contacts are limited or distant." Daniel thought about that. A county employee. Or a contractor with county access. We've narrowed it to 3 possibilities. We haven't been able to confirm which one yet because we don't want to tip the source before we have Booth in custody. "Where is he?" A pause. "We have a lead in Arizona. He used a credit card not in his own name but attached to an account we've been watching 48 hours ago. Scottsdale. That's 4 states from where he was supposed to be." "Yes. And there's a woman in Scottsdale, 71, widowed, owns her home free and clear, 2 adult children who live out of state, who received contact from a man using a name we've connected to one of Booth's prior aliases. 3 weeks ago." The sentence landed like something physical. He was already working a new target. He hadn't even fully cleared Margaret before he was already moving. "Tell me her name," Daniel said. "I can't do that. She's a potential victim in an active federal investigation, but I can tell you we have someone in contact with her now. She's been informed. She's cooperating." Solis paused. "She's safe, Officer Marsh." He exhaled. "Okay." "I want to talk to your mother," Solis said. "Formally. A recorded interview here or by video. I need her account on the record as part of the federal complaint." "She'll do it," Daniel said. "She's stronger than she looks." "Most of them are," Solis said. "That's the thing people always get wrong about these women. They think because someone was fooled, they're fragile. Your mother kept a household running for 3 months with no money and didn't reach out to anyone because she didn't want to burden her son who was doing important work. That is not fragile. That is stubborn as hell and twice as brave." Daniel didn't say anything for a moment. "Thank you for saying that," he said. "It's just accurate. I'll send a video link for tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. Make sure she's comfortable and has water. These interviews run long." He told his mother that evening. She was at the kitchen counter when he set it slicing tomatoes for a salad because she'd started cooking again the day after he'd filled the refrigerator. Small meals at first, And then real ones, like the act of having food in the house, was slowly reminding her body what normal felt like. "A federal agent wants to interview me," she said. "Yes." "On the record." "Yes." Everything you tell her goes into the formal complaint. It's part of what builds the case. She set the knife down. She turned around and leaned against the counter and crossed her arms, not in a defensive way, but in the way she'd always done when she was thinking something through properly before she spoke. "Will it go to trial?" she said. "Possibly. Probably. If he fights it." "And I'd have to testify." "Maybe. We don't know yet, but yes, potentially." She nodded slowly. She was quiet for a moment. Rex wandered in from the hallway, and she reached down and touched the top of his head without looking at him. "I'll do it," she said. "I want to do it. If there are other women out there who this happened to, and they're too scared to say anything, I don't want to be one of the ones who stays quiet." He looked at her across the kitchen. At 61 years old, thinner than she should have been, in a house that still had a plastic-patched window, and bills that needed sorting. Margaret Marsh was the straightest-spined person he'd ever met. He got it from her. He'd always known that, but he felt it with particular clarity in that moment. "Okay," he said. "Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. I'll make coffee first." The interview lasted 2.5 hours. Daniel sat off camera at his mother's request. She wanted him close, but didn't want the dynamic of a son watching to affect what she said. He listened while she walked Karen Solis through everything date by date, decision by decision, with a steadiness that clearly surprised Solis and didn't surprise Daniel at all. She talked about the church fundraiser, about the coffee Gerald brought her without being asked, about the way he'd arrived in her life during a season when she'd stopped expecting good things and had therefore been genuinely moved by small ones. She talked about the Sunday dinners and the fixed faucet and the slow way trust is built when someone is patient enough to build it carefully. And then she talked about the paperwork. She described how Gerald had spread the documents on the kitchen table, this table the same one where she and Daniel were sitting right now, and explained each page in language that was clear and calm and just technical enough to seem legitimate. How he'd pointed to the signature lines and handed her a pen and said, "Right here, Maggie," in the voice she'd come to associate with competence and care. How she'd signed because she trusted him. How she'd trusted him because he'd spent 2 years earning it. When she got to the part about the bruise, she paused. Solis waited. "He didn't hit me," Margaret said carefully. "I want to be precise about that." He grabbed my arm. It was the morning after I asked him directly about the bank account, about why the balance was so low. He said I was overreacting. I said I wanted to see the statements myself. He grabbed my arm and he said, "Maggie, I need you to trust the process." And then he let go and walked out of the room, and 2 days later, he was gone. Solis's voice was very even. "How hard did he grab your arm?" "Hard enough that I had the bruise for 3 weeks." "Did he apologize?" "No, he acted like it hadn't happened, which was almost worse." Silence on the line for a moment. "Mrs. Marsh," Solis said, "the man who did this to you has done it before. And I want you to know that what you've told me today has given us things we didn't have yesterday. You should be proud of yourself." Margaret looked at her hands on the table. "I should have called my son," she said. "You protected him from worry while he was working a dangerous assignment. You can call that a mistake if you want to. I call it a mother being a mother." Daniel stared at a fixed point on the wall and breathed very carefully. That evening, Tommy Reyes called. "I've got something," Tommy said, "and you're not going to like it." Daniel stepped outside. "Tell me." "I've been running background on Gerald's known associates, people he's mentioned in prior interviews, names that came up in the civil complaints. One of them is a guy named Paul Drennan, property appraiser, licensed in 4 states. He paused. "Daniel, Drennan is licensed in your county, and he filed appraisals on 2 properties that are named in the federal case. So Drennan's the network connection. He's the one feeding Booth the targets. That's what it looks like. But here's the part you won't like." Tommy's voice dropped. Drennan's name showed up in a departmental database request about 8 months ago. Someone inside the department ran his name, not through normal channels, through a backdoor query that left a partial log. The query was traced to a terminal in the third-floor administrative office. The air went out of the moment. "Who has access to that terminal?" Daniel said. 3 people, 2 civilian admin staff and 1 officer. "Which officer?" Silence. "Tommy." "Sergeant Rick Calloway," Tommy said quietly. Daniel didn't move for a long moment. Calloway, the man who had approved Daniel's undercover assignment. The man who had set the timeline. The man who had known before almost anyone else exactly how long Daniel was going to be gone, and exactly how unreachable he was going to be. "That's not a coincidence," Daniel said. "No," Tommy said. "It's not. And I haven't told anyone yet because I wanted to talk to you first. But Daniel, this has to go to Internal Affairs, and it has to go to Solis, today." He stood there and let it settle. Not the anger, he'd been managing the anger for 2 days, and he could keep managing it. It was the scope of it that was difficult, the way it kept expanding. What had started as a bad husband had become a financial predator, and what had become a financial predator had just become a coordinated network with a contact inside his own department. Someone who had looked at Daniel's assignment and seen an opportunity. Someone who sat in the same building, maybe nodded at him in the hallway, maybe shook his hand at the Christmas party. Someone who had helped Gerald Booth pick the right moment to destroy his mother's life. "I'll call Solis," Daniel said. "I'll file the IA referral from my end. Clean paper trail. Nothing that looks like it came from you directly." "Good," he paused. "Tommy, be careful. Always. A beat. You doing okay?" He thought about what okay meant right now, standing outside his mother's house in the dark, Rex pressing against the back of his leg through the screen door, the weight of what he'd just learned pressing down on everything else. "I'm moving," he said. "That's enough." He called Solis at 8:47 that evening. She picked up on the second ring. He told her about Calloway. All of it. The terminal access. The timing. The departmental query, Tommy's finding. He gave it to her clean, no editorializing, no emotion attached to the delivery. Facts in sequence the way it needed to be. When he finished, Solis was quiet for 4 full seconds. "Officer Marsh," she said, "I want to be very clear with you about something. What you just told me expands this investigation in a direction that means we need to move faster than we planned. Booth needs to be in custody before Calloway has any reason to think he's been made. Do you understand what I'm telling you? If Calloway warns Booth, Booth runs. And if Booth runs with that kind of warning, he goes somewhere we can't reach him quickly." "Then pick up Booth first," Daniel said. "How soon?" "If Arizona confirms his location by morning, 48 hours, maybe less." He pressed his hand flat against the doorframe and felt the old wood under his palm, solid and imperfect. 48 hours. Gerald Booth had been 3 states away, circling a 71-year-old woman he'd already decided was his next target. Sergeant Rick Calloway had been showing up to work every morning and sitting at a desk in the same building where Daniel's assignment had been filed and approved. And Margaret Marsh had been sitting in this house alone, making her soup last, explaining her bruise away, and waiting for a son she hadn't wanted to trouble. 48 hours. He could hold it together for 48 hours. Rex scratched at the screen door from inside, and Daniel opened it, and the dog walked out and sat beside him, and they both stood there in the quiet. And somewhere out there, the net was pulling tight, and Gerald Booth didn't know it yet. But he would. The 48 hours did not move at a normal speed. They moved the way time moves when something enormous is about to happen, and you have no role in making it happen slow, in the moments when you're sitting still. Then suddenly compressed when the phone rings and the world shifts 3 degrees in a direction you weren't quite prepared for. Daniel spent the first morning doing what he could do. He drove to the county courthouse and requested copies of every property filing attached to his mother's address, going back 5 years. He sat in a plastic chair in the records office and waited 40 minutes, and when the clerk handed him the folder, he went through it page by page right there at the counter because he needed to know the full scope before he could hand it cleanly to Solis. What he found on page 9 stopped him cold. There was a second lien. Not the one he'd found the first night. This was a different filing dated 11 months ago, 2 weeks before Daniel had even gone under. It was smaller, $14,000, filed against a separate parcel number attached to a small piece of undeveloped land his mother had inherited from her own mother 20 years ago. Land Margaret had mentioned exactly once in Daniel's memory at a family dinner years ago, described as worthless scrubland 40 miles outside the county that she'd never even visited. Gerald had found it, had filed against it, had done it before Daniel was even fully gone, before the window he'd waited for had fully opened. He hadn't waited for the right moment. He'd started before the moment arrived just to make sure he didn't miss it. Daniel stood at that courthouse counter and felt something shift in him that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. It was the particular feeling of understanding something completely, the full shape of what Gerald Booth was. The full calculation of it, the way a person could look at a woman who loved him and see only inventory. The land, the house, the savings, the absent son. All of it weighed and measured before the coffee at the church fundraiser had even gone cold. He photographed every page and drove back to his mother's house. She was on the phone when he came in. He could tell from the way she was sitting very straight, very still, both feet on the floor, that it wasn't a casual call. She looked up at him when he walked in, and her expression said, "Wait." He waited. She ended the call 2 minutes later and set the phone down on the table and said, "That was Linda Carver." He didn't recognize the name. "She was in my book club," Margaret said. 2 years ago, before she moved to her daughter's place in Tennessee. She called because she saw something on social media, something about financial exploitation of widows, an awareness post, and apparently my name was mentioned in a comment thread. She paused. "Daniel, Linda told me she met a man at a church event 3 years ago. A man who brought her coffee, who fixed things around her house." He sat down. "She said his name was Gary," Margaret said. "Gary Beaumont." Different name, same man. He could feel it before she finished the sentence. "Did she sign anything?" he said. "She said she signed some investment forms. She said she lost money, but assumed it was just a bad investment. She never connected it to. She never thought it was." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "She cried on the phone, Daniel. She's 73 years old, and she cried because she thought she'd just been foolish. She didn't know it was the same person." "Did she report it?" "No. She was embarrassed." He pulled out his phone and opened his contact for Solis. "I need her full name and contact information. Solis needs to talk to her." "She'll talk. I already asked." He looked at his mother. She had taken the call, had heard what Linda said, had made the connection, had already asked the right question, all of it quietly, while he was at the courthouse. She hadn't waited to be told what to do. "You're better at this than you think," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I'm angry," she said. "Anger makes you useful if you aim it right." He sent Solis the name and number, and attached the courthouse photographs in the same message. Then he went to the kitchen and made them both lunch, because the body keeps needing things regardless of what the mind is carrying, and because making food was one of the few ways he knew to say, "I'm here," without making it into a conversation. Solis called back at 2 in the afternoon. "The second lien," she said immediately. "That's important. That tells us the timeline started earlier than we thought, which affects the conspiracy charge significantly." A pause. "And Linda Carver, I'm going to reach out to her within the hour. If her account matches, and if we can tie the name Gary Beaumont to Booth through physical description and method, that's another confirmed victim, which strengthens the federal case considerably." "How many do you have now confirmed?" "With your mother and potentially Linda Carver, 13. 13 women, 13 kitchens, 13 moments when someone had spread paperwork on a table and said, "Trust me," and handed over a pen. "Where are we on Booth?" he said. "Arizona confirmed his location this morning. He's in Scottsdale staying at an extended stay property under the name Robert Gilman. He has a car registered to the same alias. He's been making contact with the target woman, the 71-year-old I mentioned, and our agent on the ground says he's accelerating the timeline, which suggests he may be sensing something." Solis's voice was precise, but there was an urgency underneath it now that hadn't been there the day before. "We're moving the arrest up, tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. Arizona time." Daniel checked the clock on the wall. Less than 18 hours. "And Calloway," he said. "Internal Affairs served him with a compelled interview notice this afternoon. He doesn't know the scope of what we have. He thinks it's a routine administrative review." She paused. "He won't be able to warn Booth tonight because we have his communications under a court-authorized monitoring order as of 3 hours ago." "You moved fast." "I move fast when someone puts a dirty cop in front of me," she said, and there was nothing in her tone that suggested she was being dramatic. Just fact. Just conviction. "Officer Marsh, tomorrow when the arrest happens, you will not be in Arizona. You will not be near the arrest. Are we clear?" "We're clear. I mean it. I've seen good cases come apart because a victim's family member got too close to the end. You've done everything right up to this point. Don't hand anyone a reason to question the integrity of this investigation." "I understand," he said. "I'll be here." "Good. A beat. Get some sleep." He didn't sleep, but he came closer than he had the night before. He sat at the kitchen table until midnight, not working anymore, just sitting with Rex on the floor beside him, and his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and he thought about Gerald Booth in an extended stay room in Scottsdale. Probably asleep, probably not worried, probably already running the numbers on the next step of whatever he was building with the woman he'd been calling for 3 weeks. He thought about 13 women. He thought about the church fundraiser, the coffee, the way trust was assembled piece by piece like a structure until it was load-bearing, until you'd built your whole sense of safety on top of it. And then the person you built it with simply removed themselves, and you were left standing on something that was never what you thought it was, trying to understand why the floor had disappeared. He thought about his mother signing that paperwork at this table. He thought about himself telling her 3 years ago, "Mom, he seems solid. Give him a chance." That sentence had been following him since the night he arrived. He'd been letting it follow him because he thought he deserved that thought. The weight of it was appropriate given what had happened. But somewhere around midnight in that quiet kitchen, something settled. He had been deceived too. Gerald Booth was a practiced predator who had spent years learning how to appear as the exact thing lonely people needed. He'd fooled Margaret. He'd fooled Linda Carver. He'd fooled the notary and the county records office, and probably a dozen other people who'd looked at him and seen a reasonable man. He had fooled Daniel, who was trained to read people, who had done it professionally, who had run the read at that dinner table and come away thinking solid guy. That wasn't negligence. That was a con so practiced, it beat the thing designed to catch it. Daniel let himself hold that for a while. Not as an absolution, he wasn't looking for that, but as an accurate assessment. The same professional standard he applied to every case. Accurate assessment was the beginning of doing things right. He went to bed at 12:30. Rex jumped up beside him the way he always did in safe houses, not trained behavior, just the dog's own decision about proximity, and Daniel didn't push him off. The phone rang at 6:42 in the morning. Arizona time, that was 5:42, which meant it was happening right now, was already in motion. Probably had been for the last 40 minutes. It was Solis. "He's in custody," she said. 3 words. Daniel sat up. "Clean arrest," he said. Very clean. He was still in bed. He came to the door thinking it was the hotel's front desk and opened it without checking the peephole. A pause. He had a laptop open on the table with emails to the target woman. He had a folder of documents, blank authorization forms, pre-filled property evaluation templates, 2 unsigned lien instruments. He was ready to move on her within the week. Daniel exhaled slowly. He said anything. He asked for his lawyer before the second officer was even through the door, which tells you everything about how well he knows this particular road. Another pause. He'll lawyer up hard and try to negotiate. But we have 13 victims, a second participant in Paul Drennan, a dirty sergeant who we can offer a deal to in exchange for cooperation, and a laptop full of active case preparation. His attorney is going to have a very difficult morning. What happens now? Federal arraignment within 72 hours. The DA in your county will coordinate on the state charges, the lien fraud, the forgery, the financial exploitation statute. Your mother will be contacted formally as an identified victim, which begins the process for any potential restitution. Solis's voice shifted just slightly. It's going to be a long process from here, Officer Marsh. Months, probably. Maybe more if he fights every motion. I want you to prepare your mother for that. She's ready for it, he said. I think she is too. A beat. Officer Marsh, I want you to know the file you built in that first night, 47 pages, clean documentation. A timeline that cross-referenced perfectly against material we'd spent 8 months assembling. That is not a small thing. That moved this case forward in a way that mattered. He sat on the edge of the bed with Rex warm against his side, and felt something he hadn't let himself feel since he'd pulled up in front of this house and seen the dead lawn and the dark window. Not relief. Not yet. But the beginning of the path toward it. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me. Thank yourself for doing it right. He ended the call and sat there for a moment. Then he got up, went down the hall, and knocked softly on his mother's door. Come in, she said. She was awake. She'd been awake. He could tell the lamp on the book open on the nightstand, but face down, the posture of someone who had been lying still, but not sleeping. He sat on the edge of the bed and said, "They got him." She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at the ceiling. Her jaw moved slightly, just once, the way a person's jaw moves when they're pressing something down. Where? She said. Arizona. 6 this morning. He's in federal custody. She nodded. He was already setting up his next one, Daniel said. He had the documents ready. He was going to move on her within the week. But he didn't. No, he didn't. She looked at him then. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. She was doing the thing she did, holding it at a controlled distance, letting herself feel it without being swept by it. Is it over? She said. The arrest is over, he said honestly. The case isn't. It'll take time. There'll be hearings, probably a trial. You'll have to give testimony. It won't be quick. But he's not out there. He's not out there. She reached over and put her hand on his arm. Not squeezing, not clutching, just resting. The way she used to put her hand on him when he was a kid who'd had a bad day, and she didn't have the right words, but wanted him to feel that she was present. You did good, she said. He looked at her hand on his arm. He thought about everything the last 4 days had contained: the dead lawn and the dark window, the refrigerator with almost nothing in it, the legal pad covered in handwriting at 2 in the morning. Tommy's voice on the phone, Solis's voice, the courthouse, the second lien, Linda Carver crying at 73 years old because she'd thought she was just foolish. We did good, he said. Rex pushed the bedroom door open the rest of the way with his nose and walked in and looked at both of them, and then lay down on the floor at the foot of the bed, tucked his nose under his paw, and closed his eyes. Margaret laughed. It was small, just a breath of it, but it was real. And it was the first time Daniel had heard it since he'd come home. He stayed sitting there on the edge of her bed while the morning came through the window, and the house, quiet and imperfect, and still in need of so much work, held them both. Somewhere in Arizona, Gerald Booth was in a federal holding cell asking for a lawyer who was going to have a very difficult morning. And in a bedroom in Callaway Street, a mother and her son and a German shepherd who had been through everything together sat in the early light and breathed. But the case wasn't closed. The restitution hadn't started. 13 women were waiting for a system to acknowledge what had been taken from them. And in a department building 2 miles away, a sergeant named Calloway was about to sit down for a compelled interview and discover that the clean answer he'd been counting on no longer existed. It wasn't over. But Gerald Booth was done running. The compelled interview with Sergeant Rick Calloway lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. Daniel wasn't in the room. He wasn't allowed to be, and he didn't try to be, because he had promised Solace clean hands, and he intended to keep that promise all the way to the end. But Tommy Reyes was there sitting across from Calloway, with 2 internal affairs investigators, and a representative from the federal task force. And Tommy called Daniel when it was over and said 3 words before anything else. He flipped, Tommy said. Completely. Daniel was at his mother's kitchen table when the call came. He stood up and walked to the window and stood there with the phone against his ear. "Tell me," he said. He gave them everything. Drennan, the database. Access the method for flagging targets. He confirmed he ran Booth's associate Paul Drennan through the system 18 months ago and passed the results along through a personal email account he thought he'd deleted. Tommy paused. He also confirmed that he knew about your mother. Not specifically, he says he didn't know it was your mother, but he knew Booth was actively working a target in this county while you were under. He says he told himself it wasn't his business. The sentence sat there for a moment. He told himself it wasn't his business. Daniel had worked with Calloway for 3 years, had attended his daughter's graduation party, had borrowed his truck once to move a piece of furniture, had trusted the man's professional judgment on assignments that put Daniel in rooms with dangerous people. How long had he been connected to Booth? Daniel said. 5 years. Started as a referral. Calloway sent Booth's name to a mutual acquaintance as a, quote, property investment contact. He says he didn't know what Booth was doing at first. The investigators think he's probably telling the truth about that part. But somewhere around year 2 he figured it out and kept taking the payments anyway. A beat. He was getting 4% of whatever Booth cleared on each victim. On 13 confirmed victims, that's... I don't want to know the number, Daniel said. Okay. He stood at the window and breathed. Outside, the lawn was still overgrown. He had a contractor coming on Friday to address the roof, and he'd been cutting the grass himself in the evening section by section, not because he'd planned it that way, but because it gave him something physical to do with what he was carrying. He could see where he'd gotten to yesterday, the left half still high, the right half cut down a visible line between the two. What happens to him? Daniel said. Calloway federal charges minimum. Conspiracy obstruction accessory to financial exploitation. His union rep is already negotiating, but the DA's office isn't feeling generous. Tommy's voice was flat in the way it got when he was keeping his own feelings out of it. He'll lose the badge. Probably does time. Good. Daniel, I know it's not my call, and I know I don't get to feel satisfied about it yet. I'm just telling you it's good. Yeah, Tommy said quietly. It is. He told his mother that evening while she was making dinner, really making it a full meal, chicken and vegetables and cornbread from a recipe she'd been making since Daniel was 8 years old. He told her about Calloway while she was stirring something on the stove, and she went very still for a moment, the spoon not moving, and then she started stirring again. Someone inside the department, she said. Yes. Someone who knew you. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Did he know it was me, specifically? He says no. The investigators believe him. She thought about that. He watched her process it. Watched the careful way she held it, turned it over, looked at all its sides. I don't know if that makes it better or worse, she said finally. I've been trying to decide the same thing. She set the spoon down and turned around. It makes it worse, she said. Because if he'd known it was you, if he'd looked at a name and thought that's Marsh's mother, and done it anyway, that would be a man who made a conscious, deliberate choice to harm a specific person. That's evil, but at least it's personal. It has a face. She shook her head. Not knowing means I was just a number to him. Just a percentage point. Just a line in someone else's calculation that he'd decided not to think too hard about. He looked at her across the kitchen. "That's it exactly," he said. "I know." She picked up the spoon again. "Sit down, Daniel. Dinner's almost ready." He sat down. Rex came in from the hallway and settled under the table near his feet, and the kitchen smelled like cornbread and something close to normal. And Daniel sat in it and let himself feel the particular texture of this moment, not healed, not finished, but turning a corner. The federal arraignment for Gerald Booth happened 6 days later. Daniel did not go to Arizona for it. He watched the docket update online sitting at his mother's table with his laptop open, and when the entry appeared, Gerald Raymond Booth entered plea of not guilty on all federal counts, remanded to custody pending bail hearing. He closed the laptop and went outside and sat on the porch steps with Rex. The not guilty plea didn't surprise him. It was the move of a man who believed he was smarter than the case against him, who believed that his lawyer could find something somewhere in the process that would give him room. Gerald Booth had been running this particular calculation for years. The calculation that said, careful preparation beats accountability, that the system has gaps if you know where to look, that people who trust you are people you can outmaneuver. He had run that calculation one time too many. 3 weeks later, Paul Drennan was arrested at his office and charged with conspiracy and computer fraud. He did not flip as quickly as Calloway. He held out for 9 days before his attorney advised him that the federal case against him was airtight, and the only question remaining was how much time he wanted to spend in a cell. He gave a full statement on day 10. His statement added 2 more victims to the confirmed list. 15 total. 15 women. 15 kitchens. Solis called Daniel the morning the Drennan statement came through. 15, she said. And I think the real number is higher. Some of them never reported because they didn't know they could. Some of them assumed it was their own fault. Some of them are gone. She paused. But 15 is what we can prove, and 15 is what goes in front of a jury. Will it go to trial? Daniel said. Or will he take a deal? His attorney has made 2 preliminary approaches about a plea. We've rejected both. The U.S. Attorney's Office wants a trial. They want a verdict on record. They want it documented in a courtroom in public what this man did, and how he did it, and how many people he did it to. Another pause. Your mother will have to testify. She knows. She's ready. I know she is. I've spoken with her twice this week. A brief silence. Officer Marsh, I want to ask you something directly. Go ahead. The transfer request you filed to the County Financial Crimes Task Force. I've been asked to provide a professional assessment of your suitability for the unit. She let that land. I'm going to give you a very strong recommendation, but I want to hear from you directly why you want the assignment. He thought about how to answer that, not about what the right answer was. He knew what the right answer was, but about how to say it in a way that was honest rather than polished. Because I built a 47-page file in one night on a case involving my own family, he said, which means I should have been too emotional to think clearly, and I wasn't. I was angry, and I was guilty, and I was exhausted, and I still put together something that you told me moved your 8-month case forward in a material way. He paused. And because there are families out there right now who haven't come home yet, whose mothers are sitting in kitchens with not enough food and too many unpaid bills and a bruise they're explaining away. And somebody needs to be looking for those cases before the son comes home and finds the refrigerator empty. Solis was quiet for a moment. That's the right answer, she said. It's just the true one. Those are usually the same thing. Another pause. You'll hear from the unit commander by the end of the week. The call came in 4 days. Daniel accepted the transfer on a Thursday morning effective in 2 weeks, which gave him time to close out his current caseload and get his mother sorted properly before he shifted gears. He told Margaret that evening. She was in the living room with Rex beside her, reading an actual book this time, not the face-down posture of someone pretending. She looked up when he came in, and something in his face must have told her it was good news, because she closed the book before he even said anything. "The transfer," she said. "Approved." She nodded slowly. "Financial crimes." "Yes." "Because of me. Because of you and 15 other women and every person in a situation like yours who hasn't been found yet." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp was on behind her. The window was fixed. The lawn outside was level and cut, both halves matching, now the line between them gone. "You're going to be good at it," she said. "I know." She smiled at that, at the plainness of it, at the absence of false modesty, and it was the smile he remembered from before all of this, the one that had been buried under 3 months of quiet endurance and careful deflection. It had been coming back gradually, the way things come back when the weight that was pressing them down is slowly, systematically removed. The trial date for Gerald Booth was set for 8 months out. In the weeks before Daniel started his new assignment, he came home every evening to his mother's table. He fixed things around the house, one by one: the outlet in the hallway, a cabinet hinge in the kitchen, the cracked concrete on the path to the front door. Small repairs, done properly, done to last. He called the bank with his mother and began the formal process of contesting the fraudulent lien, which was slow and required documentation and phone calls that went nowhere the first 2 times and somewhere the third, the way these things always worked. He sat with her in the evenings. They watched television sometimes and talked sometimes, and sometimes they just sat in the same room and let the quiet be what it was. Not the hollow quiet of a woman alone in a house that had been picked clean, but the full quiet of 2 people who had come through something together and didn't need to narrate it to know what it meant. Rex learned the layout of the house completely within the first week, and after that moved through it the way he moved through every place he'd ever worked, like he belonged there, like the space had been waiting for exactly this dog to fill it, which was the particular talent of good working animals and good partners alike. On the morning Daniel started his new assignment, he sat at his mother's kitchen table before the shift. Coffee. Cornbread she'd made the night before. Rex at his feet. She sat across from him, and they didn't say much because the morning before a new thing starts doesn't always need words. She refilled his cup without asking. He thanked her without looking up from his phone, where the first case file for his new unit was already open, already pulling at his attention, already full of names and dates, and the specific kind of damage that comes from someone deciding another person's trust was a resource to be extracted. When he stood to leave, she walked him to the door. He hugged her. She held on for a moment, the way she'd held on the night he came home, tight, and then releasing into something steadier. "Be careful," she said. "Always. And Daniel." She stepped back and looked at him. "Find them. The ones that haven't been found yet. Find them before it gets to what it got to with me." He held that for a moment. The weight of it, and the purpose inside the weight. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He walked to the cruiser. Rex jumped in. The engine turned over clean and steady. He pulled out onto Callaway Street and pointed toward the highway and the work that was waiting. Behind him, the house had its lights on. The window was fixed. The lawn was level. And Margaret Marsh stood in the doorway for a moment before going back inside, not because she needed to watch him leave, but because she wanted to see him go with purpose. Gerald Booth would stand trial. Callaway would answer for what he chose to ignore. 15 women would have their names read into a federal record. And the ones who hadn't been found yet, the ones sitting right now in dim kitchens with not enough food and too much silence and a bruise they hadn't told anyone about, they had someone looking now. A son had come home and found his mother abandoned, and he had not looked away, and he had not broken, and he had not let guilt become paralysis or anger become recklessness. He had done the hardest thing a person trained to protect can do when they discover they failed to protect the one person who mattered most. He had done it right. He had done it clean. And then he had built something from it that would outlast the case, outlast the trial, outlast every careful calculation Gerald Booth had ever made about who was watching and who wasn't. Because somebody was always watching now. And that somebody was coming.